He paid out of his own pocket to build an independent studio and overthrow the giant record labels. Tompall Glaser was the true godfather of outlaw country, but the suffocating pressure of the Nashville system shattered his mind. Spiraling into acute alcoholism, he descended into clinical paranoia. He personally drove away his closest brothers, completely destroyed his own empire, and died in absolute ruin. Thomas Paul Glaser was born on September 3, 1933, directly into the punishing agricultural reality of Spalding, Nebraska. He was the eldest son in a family reliant on manual labor for survival during the Great Depression. He, alongside his younger brothers Chuck and Jim, utilized their vocal cords as an exit strategy from the fields. By analyzing the structural mechanics of sibling harmony, they developed a tight, precise vocal blend that eliminated the need for complex instrumentation. They treated singing as a trade. They booked local radio slots and regional events, converting acoustic energy into basic capital. In 1957, they executed a calculated maneuver by securing a spot on Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts in New York. They won. The victory provided immediate national broadcast exposure, which Tompall leveraged to relocate the trio to the commercial center of country music, Nashville, Tennessee. Upon arrival, Tompall did not seek to immediately subvert the industry. He recognized that to dismantle a machine, one must first map its internal wiring. The Nashville music industry in the late 1950s and early 1960s was an assembly line controlled by major labels and publishing conglomerates. Singers were temporary employees. Tompall strategically positioned the Glaser brothers as essential, high-volume session laborers. They secured the patronage of established star Marty Robbins, who absorbed them into his touring and recording apparatus. Robbins provided them with a steady wage, but Tompall closely observed the financial disparity between the performer and the owner of the copyright. The brothers entered the studio system specifically operating within facilities like RCA Studio B. Tompall mandated a grueling work ethic. They became the primary background vocalists for the entire commercial apparatus. The work was physically taxing and highly regulated. A standard recording session under the American Federation of Musicians union rules lasted exactly 3 hours. Within those 180 minutes, the session leader dictated the recording of 4 distinct tracks. Tompall and his brothers stood behind RCA 44 or U47 microphones, reading hastily written chord charts and vocal arrangements. They were expected to deliver flawless harmony on the first or second take. There was no room for artistic input or technical delays. Time was capital, and the label executives monitoring from the control room penalized inefficiency with immediate replacement. Tompall recognized the brutal math of session work. The union scale paid a flat rate for the 3-hour block. It was a fixed income regardless of the product's ultimate commercial yield. When the Glaser brothers provided the foundational backing vocals for massive commercial hits, they received only their initial session fee. They owned no equity in the master recording. They received 0% of the mechanical royalties when the vinyl was pressed and sold. Tompall watched label executives and producers generate immense wealth from the sonic architecture his brothers helped construct. This daily observation forged his profound cynicism toward the Nashville establishment. He was analyzing the extraction of wealth from the working artist. The sheer volume of their session work was staggering. Tompall pushed the trio to accept bookings across multiple labels and competing studios. They provided the vocal padding that smoothed out the rough edges of traditional country singers, making the tracks palatable for national pop radio syndication. They worked behind Patsy Cline, effectively harmonizing with the sweeping string arrangements dictated by producer Owen Bradley. They backed up George Jones, adjusting their vocal attack to match his unpredictable phrasing. Tompall operated as the vocal director on the floor, instantaneously calculating the necessary harmonic intervals required by the producer and drilling his brothers until the execution was clinical. The most historically significant application of their labor occurred on March 25, 1963, at Columbia Recording Studios. Johnny Cash was recording Ring of Fire. Cash intended to introduce Mexican mariachi horns to the track, a radical departure from standard country instrumentation. The horns threatened to overpower the acoustic foundation of the song. Tompall engineered the vocal countermeasure. He arranged a driving, rhythmic background harmony that locked perfectly with the brass, anchoring the track and providing the necessary commercial sheen. The song became a massive global hit, defining Cash's career. The Glaser brothers, despite their critical structural contribution, collected their standard union fee and walked out of the studio to find their next booking. Simultaneous with their session schedule, Tompall managed their touring commitments. Touring in the early 1960s lacked modern logistical support. The brothers drove their own vehicles hundreds of miles between regional auditoriums and state fairs. They acted as their own road managers, handling cash transactions with local promoters and negotiating stage time. They frequently served as the opening act for major stars, then immediately changed out of their stage wear to play in the backing band for the headliner. The physical toll was severe. Sleep deprivation was constant. The diet consisted of roadside diner food, and the environment was saturated with amphetamines, widely distributed among musicians to maintain the punishing schedule dictated by the booking agencies. Throughout this physical and vocal grind, Tompall maintained a strict focus on the mechanics of publishing. He noted how producers often demanded a co-writing credit on a song merely for allowing it to be recorded during a session. This practice effectively legalized extortion within the Nashville system, siphoned millions of dollars from the actual creators of the intellectual property. Tompall studied the standard publishing contracts, identifying the clauses that trapped songwriters into long-term exploitative agreements. He realized that recording a hit record was a temporary victory. Owning the publishing rights to that hit was generational wealth. He began testing the boundaries of label control. While the Glaser brothers were signed to Decca Records and later MGM, Tompall actively resisted the strict stylistic mandates imposed by the A and R departments. He argued over song selection. He pushed back against the forced inclusion of overly sweet string arrangements, demanding a more stripped-down, aggressive acoustic sound that reflected their live performances. The label executives viewed this resistance as insubordination from employees who were expected to remain compliant. Tompall was labeled difficult, a term weaponized by the industry to isolate artists who questioned the financial and creative hierarchy. By the mid-1960s, Tompall had gathered sufficient intelligence. He knew the cost of studio time. He understood the margins on vinyl pressing. He had mapped the exact flow of capital from the radio station back to the publishing houses on Music Row. He recognized that as long as the major labels controlled the physical recording spaces and the publishing catalogs, the artist would remain a highly skilled, underpaid laborer. The session work had provided the initial capital, but Tompall was done selling his time for a flat fee. He decided to acquire his own means of production. He began the process of liquidating his available assets, preparing to sever his reliance on the RCA and Columbia studios, and actively hunting for a piece of real estate that would serve as the staging ground for a direct assault on the Nashville monopoly. In 1969, Tompall Glaser initiated a direct assault on the corporate infrastructure of Music Row by executing a real estate transaction. He utilized the capital accumulated from thousands of hours of union-scale session work to purchase a 2-story property at 916 19th Avenue South in Nashville. The structure was not a purpose-built recording facility. It was a former residential home that had been converted into a physical therapy clinic. It sat geographically close to the centralized power structures of RCA, Columbia, and Decca, but it operated under a completely separate jurisdiction. Tompall did not intend to build a competitor to the major labels. He intended to build an autonomous zone. The industry would soon label the facility Hillbilly Central. The physical conversion of 916 19th Avenue South required stripping the building down to its load-bearing walls. Tompall bypassed the established network of Nashville studio architects and acousticians, recognizing that their design philosophies were heavily tied to the Nashville sound. Standard studios like RCA Studio B were constructed to maximize acoustic space, utilizing large tracking rooms with high ceilings to accommodate 30-piece string sections and vocal choruses. Tompall required the exact opposite. He ordered the construction of a small, heavily baffled tracking room designed specifically to eliminate natural reverberation. The objective was a dead room. By stripping the room of acoustic reflection, the audio engineer could isolate individual instruments, specifically the kick drum and the electric bass. This isolation was a crucial mechanical requirement for the heavier, rhythm-driven sound that standard country music production actively suppressed. He outfitted the control room with high-capacity multi-track recording consoles. While the major labels were slow to upgrade their infrastructure, relying on older 3-track and 4-track machines to maintain a standardized assembly line, Tompall invested heavily in emerging audio technology. He installed advanced tape machines that allowed for complex overdubbing and track isolation. This technological advantage fundamentally altered the recording process. An artist was no longer forced to capture a perfect live take with a dozen studio musicians simultaneously. They could record a rhythm track, assess the playback, and layer additional instrumentation at their own pace. Tompall transferred the control of the master recording from the clock to the artist. With the hardware installed, Tompall implemented a strict operational manifesto that directly violated the established protocols of the American Federation of Musicians and the Nashville label executives. The standard corporate procedure dictated strict 3-hour recording blocks. Musicians clocked in, recorded 4 songs, and clocked out. At Hillbilly Central, Tompall abolished the clock. If an artist wanted to begin recording at 2 in the morning, and work for 14 consecutive hours, the console remained powered on. Furthermore, he explicitly banned label executives, A and R representatives, and corporate producers from the premises. The doors were physically locked. To enter the control room, an individual required direct authorization from Tompall or the recording artist. This created a secure perimeter where artists could experiment, make errors, and utilize unauthorized recording techniques without fear of corporate reprisal or immediate termination of their recording contracts. The most aggressive violation of industry standards was Tompall's authorization of road bands within the studio. The Nashville cartel enforced a strict monopoly regarding studio personnel. Artists were contractually obligated to use the A-team, a closed circle of elite unionized session musicians. While highly competent, these musicians provided a standardized uniform sound. An artist's actual touring band, the musicians who played the material live on the road night after night, were barred from the recording floor. Tompall dismantled this barrier. He actively encouraged artists to bring their road bands into Hillbilly Central. The resulting recordings lacked the polished clinical precision of the A-team, but they captured the raw kinetic energy of a live performance. This mechanical shift was the foundational audio signature of the outlaw movement. Parallel to the physical studio, Tompall weaponized intellectual property by establishing Glaser Publications. The publishing sector was the primary mechanism of wealth extraction in Nashville. The standard industry contract demanded a 50% split of the mechanical royalties, with the publishing house retaining total ownership of the copyright. In many cases, producers and executives demanded a percentage of the writer's share simply for allowing the song to be recorded. Tompall recognized this as legalized theft. Glaser Publications introduced a hostile business model. It offered songwriters contracts that allowed them to retain total ownership of their copyrights and a significantly higher percentage of the mechanical royalties. He was essentially undercutting the profit margins of every major publishing house on Music Row. He targeted songwriters who had been rejected by the mainstream apparatus for being too abrasive, too literary, or too structurally complex. He signed Kinky Friedman, a satirist whose material was considered unrecordable by conservative label standards. He signed Billy Joe Shaver, a volatile, hard-living songwriter from Texas, whose lyrics detailed barroom violence, poverty, and existential dread with journalistic precision. Tompall did not demand that they sanitize their lyrics for radio play. He provided them with an office, a weekly stipend, and absolute creative autonomy. He recognized that the commercial value of their catalogs would eventually surpass the manufactured pop country hits of the era, provided they were allowed to write without corporate interference. The convergence of Tompall's infrastructure and the mounting artist rebellion crystallized with the arrival of Waylon Jennings. By 1972, Jennings was locked in a brutal contractual dispute with RCA Records. He was physically exhausted, heavily reliant on amphetamines to maintain a punishing tour schedule, and deeply resentful of the RCA production methods. Jennings had been forced to record with studio musicians he did not select, singing material he did not write, under the supervision of producers he despised. He was generating significant revenue for the label, but he possessed zero creative control over his master recordings. Jennings, utilizing a newly hired aggressive New York manager named Neil Reshin, forced RCA to renegotiate his contract. The resulting agreement granted Jennings a concession that was unprecedented in Nashville: the legal right to produce his own records at an independent studio of his choosing. Jennings immediately bypassed the RCA facilities and relocated his entire operation to Hillbilly Central. He brought his touring band, the Wailers, onto the tracking floor. The environment at Glaser Sound Studios suited Jennings's operational parameters. The facility was populated by a chaotic mix of musicians, songwriters, mechanics, and members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. It operated 24 hours a day, fueled by a steady influx of black beauties, whiskey, and a shared contempt for the Nashville establishment. Inside this compound, Jennings and Tompall began production on the album Honky Tonk Heroes. The project was a massive financial and professional risk. Instead of utilizing established Nashville hitmakers, Jennings decided to record an entire album composed almost exclusively of songs written by Billy Joe Shaver, an unproven writer on the Glaser Publications roster. Tompall co-produced the sessions. They engineered the sound to deliberately antagonize RCA. They pushed the electric bass high in the mix, utilizing a heavy driving rhythm section that mimicked rock and roll rather than traditional country. They bypassed the standard vocal booth, often recording Jennings's lead vocals live on the floor with the band to capture the bleed of the instruments into the vocal microphone. When RCA executives heard the rough mixes of Honky Tonk Heroes, they panicked. The audio was harsh. The bass frequencies threatened to cause standard turntable needles to skip, and the lyrical content focused on drifters, violence, and transient living. They demanded that Jennings return to RCA Studio B and re-record the material with standard session musicians. Jennings, backed by the legal framework of his renegotiated contract and the physical security of Hillbilly Central, refused. He threatened to withhold the master tapes entirely. Tompall maintained possession of the physical reels. RCA eventually capitulated and released the album in 1973. Honky Tonk Heroes was a critical triumph. It proved that a country artist could bypass the established manufacturing process, utilize unauthorized personnel, record in an unapproved facility, and still deliver a commercially viable product. The album broke the psychological hold of the major labels. It demonstrated that the artist, not the executive, could control the means of production. Tompall Glaser had successfully provided the blueprint, the physical space, and the financial backing to defeat the Nashville monopoly. The release of Honky Tonk Heroes established the blueprint, but it did not immediately dismantle the corporate structure of Nashville. It proved the independent model was viable, but the major labels still controlled the national distribution networks and the heavy manufacturing plants required to press vinyl by the hundreds of thousands. The true financial peak of the outlaw movement and the catalyst for its subsequent collapse arrived through a cynical corporate calculation rather than an artistic directive. By 1975, Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson were generating unprecedented capital. Nelson had relocated to Texas, circumventing the Nashville establishment entirely to build a massive, fiercely loyal touring demographic. Jennings was utilizing Hillbilly Central to churn out hit records on his own terms. RCA Records, the very institution they had rebelled against, realized they were losing control of the narrative. More importantly, they realized they were leaving money on the table. The executive tasked with capturing this lost revenue was Jerry Bradley, the head of RCA Nashville. Bradley recognized that the press had heavily branded Jennings and Nelson as outlaws. He decided to commodify the rebellion. Bradley's strategy was highly efficient and required minimal overhead. He did not book studio time or commission new material. He executed a catalog raid. He retrieved previously recorded, unreleased, or underperforming tracks from the RCA vaults featuring Jennings and Nelson. He needed additional material to justify a full LP release. Jennings leveraged his newly acquired industry power to dictate the inclusion of his wife, Jessie Coulter, and the man who had provided his operational base, Tompall Glaser. The resulting product was the compilation album Wanted, The Outlaws, released in January 1976. The packaging was a deliberate marketing fabrication. The cover featured the four artists rendered as vintage, sepia-toned fugitives on a wanted poster. It sold the aesthetic of danger to a mainstream audience. The irony was absolute. The definitive album of the anti-establishment movement was a compilation of recycled tapes, packaged and distributed by the largest corporate label in Nashville, specifically to boost first quarter earnings. Despite its manufactured origins, the market response was catastrophic to the old Nashville business model. Wanted, The Outlaws became the first country music album in history to sell 1 million physical units. The Recording Industry Association of America had to create the platinum certification category for country music specifically to quantify its sales volume. The album dominated the Billboard charts, crossing over into the mainstream pop market. The financial windfall was immediate and staggering. For Waylon, Willie, and Jesse, the platinum certification acted as a global amplifier. They transitioned from playing regional auditoriums to headlining massive outdoor stadiums and sports arenas. Their touring revenue skyrocketed into the millions. They became franchise entities, commanding exorbitant performance fees and merchandising monopolies. Tompall Glaser's trajectory following the release was starkly different, constrained by the very infrastructure he had built. He was one of the four faces on the platinum cover, cementing his historical status, but he did not possess the same touring apparatus as his peers. His solo output during this exact period yielded a distinct, highly cynical hit. In 1975, prior to the compilation's release, Tompall recorded Put Another Log on the Fire, written by Shel Silverstein. The track was a deadpan, abrasive satire of traditional gender roles and domestic exploitation. It rejected the sanitized romantic narrative standard on country radio. It peaked at number 21 on the Billboard country charts. It proved Tompall could generate his own commercial traction without relying solely on background harmonies or production credits. However, a hit single and a platinum compilation credit did not alleviate Tompall's primary operational burden. While Jennings and Nelson were extracting millions from the stadium circuit, Tompall remained anchored to 916 19th Avenue South. He was the sole proprietor of Hillbilly Central. Running an independent 24-hour recording facility with an open-door policy for transient musicians is a logistical and financial nightmare. The overhead costs were relentless. The multi-track consoles required constant, expensive calibration. The magnetic recording tape, which Tompall often subsidized for his artists, was a massive recurring expense. The electricity bills for a facility operating high-voltage equipment around the clock were astronomical. Furthermore, the open environment Tompall fostered attracted an increasingly volatile demographic. The studio became a haven for hangers-on minor criminals and members of outlaw motorcycle clubs. They consumed the studio's resources, damaged the physical property, and contributed zero capital to the operation. Tompall found himself functioning not merely as a producer, but as a landlord, a bank manager, and a bouncer for an increasingly chaotic clientele. The financial disparity bred deep structural resentment. Tompall was fronting the operational risk. He was dealing with the Nashville Metro Police, the utility companies, and the Musicians Union, which continually attempted to levy fines against the studio for utilizing unauthorized non-union labor. His peers were utilizing his facility to generate the master recordings that made them millionaires, while Tompall absorbed the collateral damage and the physical depreciation of the asset. He was operating a subsidized sanctuary for artists who were rapidly becoming wealthier than he was. To manage the crushing operational stress, Tompall did not turn to the amphetamines favored by the touring artists. He utilized alcohol. The transition from social drinking to clinical dependency was a documented physiological process. The daily consumption of high-proof liquor became a structural requirement for him to function within the chaos of the studio. Initially, high-proof liquor functioned as a ruthless stress management tool, allowing Tompall to aggressively navigate studio disputes and maintain his adversarial stance against the major labels. However, sustained chemical saturation fundamentally altered his brain chemistry. The baseline cynicism that had empowered him to dismantle the Nashville corporate structure soon mutated into a clinical, unmanageable paranoia. By the late 1970s, the physical realities of severe alcoholism began to manifest. His liver function deteriorated, impacting his body's ability to process toxins, which subsequently accelerated the neurological damage. The alcohol stopped acting as a stress management tool and began operating as a paranoid catalyst. The baseline cynicism that had allowed him to accurately assess and dismantle the Nashville corporate structure mutated into a clinical aggressive paranoia. He began scrutinizing the ledgers of Glaser publications with obsessive, irrational suspicion. The publishing company, initially designed to protect songwriters from corporate theft, became the focal point of his delusions. He started looking at the mechanical royalty statements and the studio booking logs, convincing himself that the numbers were being manipulated. He developed the fixed, unshakable belief that the artists who utilized Hillbilly Central, the very artists he had protected and produced, were actively conspiring to bankrupt him and seize control of his assets. The sanctuary he built was actively turning into a psychological prison. The financial infrastructure of the outlaw movement was inherently unstable. When Waylon Jennings brought Neil Reshin into the ecosystem, the dynamic at Hillbilly Central shifted from a localized rebellion to a corporate negotiation. Reshin was not a musician. He was a New York-based business manager with a reputation for ruthless, abrasive negotiation tactics, having previously handled accounts for artists like Miles Davis and Frank Zappa. Reshin recognized that Jennings's master recordings were generating massive capital, but that capital was flowing through the physical and legal architecture owned by Tompall Glaser. Reshin's primary fiduciary duty was to consolidate Jennings's wealth and minimize his overhead. This objective placed him in direct, unavoidable conflict with Tompall's operation. Glaser operated on handshake agreements, cash advances, and a localized honor code among musicians. Rieschen operated on audited ledgers, tax liabilities, and rigid corporate contracts. Rieschen viewed Hillbilly Central not as a sanctuary, but as a financial liability. He began aggressively scrutinizing the studio booking rates, the hourly billing for audio engineers, and the publishing splits associated with Glaser publications. He demanded itemized invoices for every spool of magnetic tape and every hour of console time. Tompall, already suffering from severe alcohol-induced cognitive degradation, interpreted Riessen's standard accounting practices as a hostile corporate takeover. The alcohol amplified his defensive instincts into clinical paranoia. He became convinced that Rieschen was systematically restructuring Jennings's contracts to intentionally bankrupt the studio and seize its assets. The paranoia did not remain internal. It became an operational hazard. Tompall altered the physical security protocols of 916 19th Avenue South. He began locking the doors during peak daytime hours, restricting access to the tracking rooms. He installed a strict, hostile vetting process for anyone entering the building, treating longtime session musicians, delivery personnel, and assistant engineers as potential corporate spies. He reportedly began carrying firearms within the facility, placing loaded handguns on the recording console during sessions. The open, collaborative environment that defined the early 1970s was completely eradicated, replaced by an atmosphere of constant interrogation. Artists recording in the studio reported that Tompall would abruptly halt sessions, interrogate them regarding the specifics of their publishing contracts, and accuse them of cutting backdoor deals with RCA executives. The psychological warfare inevitably concentrated on Waylon Jennings. The two men had operated as the dual architects of the movement, but the chemical dependency and financial stress shattered the partnership. Tompall accused Jennings directly of conspiring with Rieschen to steal publishing rights and embezzle studio funds. He alleged that Jennings was utilizing Hillbilly Central's resources, specifically the high-capacity tape machines, electricity, and engineer overtime, without proper compensation. In Tompall's mind, Jennings was bleeding the operation dry to fund his own stadium tours while leaving Glaser with the utility bills. Jennings, who was heavily reliant on cocaine and amphetamines and dealing with his own massive touring pressures, responded to the accusations with open hostility. The disputes ceased to be professional disagreements and escalated into vicious physical confrontations within the studio corridors. The historical record regarding the exact financial truth of this schism remains fragmented. Some sources and industry insiders claim that Rieschen, recognizing Tompall's incapacitated state, actively attempted to siphon publishing revenue and leverage the studio's mounting debt to legally seize control of Jennings's master tapes. These accounts suggest Tompall's paranoia was rooted in actual predatory business practices initiated by Jennings's management team. Other sources maintain that the theft was entirely fabricated. They assert that Rieschen was simply enforcing standard accounting protocols to protect Jennings from the financial chaos and lack of documentation at Hillbilly Central, and that Tompall's severe alcohol psychosis hallucinated a grand conspiracy out of routine bookkeeping adjustments. Regardless of the legal reality, the psychological environment became completely unsustainable. Jennings made a definitive operational decision. He terminated his association with Hillbilly Central. He ordered his road crew and management personnel to enter the facility, dismantle his equipment, pack up his instruments, and physically remove his master tapes from the vault. Jennings relocated his entire recording operation, taking his massive platinum-level production budget with him. This departure was the fatal blow to Tompall's financial model. Jennings was the economic anchor of the studio. When his capital was withdrawn, the financial viability of the facility vanished instantly. The cascading failure was immediate. The other artists on the Glaser Publications roster, recognizing the structural collapse and unwilling to navigate the hostile environment, began seeking exit strategies. Billy Joe Shaver and Kinky Friedman eventually moved on, requiring stable recording environments, unburdened by paranoid interrogation. The elite session musicians stopped accepting bookings at the studio, unwilling to deal with Tompall's volatile temper and the constant threat of unpaid invoices. The revenue stream stopped abruptly, but the operational costs, the commercial mortgage, the industrial utility bills, the equipment maintenance, remained fixed and began to compound. Tompall was left holding a massive specialized facility with zero capital generation. The recording consoles sat dormant. The tape machines went uncalibrated. Tompall reacted to the financial collapse by isolating himself entirely. He locked the heavy soundproof doors, remaining inside the decaying studio, consumed by the alcohol and the absolute certainty that he had been destroyed by the very men he had armed for war. The physical removal of Waylon Jennings's master tapes and recording equipment from 916 19th Avenue South in 1977 triggered an immediate, catastrophic liquidity crisis for Tompall Glaser. The general public viewed Hillbilly Central as a cultural landmark, but strictly in terms of corporate accounting, it was a massive, highly specialized liability. The facility was not subsidized by a parent conglomerate. It was a privately held commercial asset that relied entirely on the continuous cash flow generated by its primary tenant. When Jennings relocated his operation, that revenue stream vanished overnight. The silence inside the studio had a specific crushing financial weight. The operational overhead remained static and relentless. Tompall was responsible for commercial property taxes in a rapidly gentrifying Nashville district. The industrial utility bills required to keep high-voltage recording consoles and climate-controlled tape vaults operational were astronomical. He still had audio engineers, session players, and administrative staff on this payroll. Without Jennings's platinum-level recording budgets to underwrite these costs, the mathematics of the operation failed instantly. Tompall was trapped inside a financial black hole of his own making, bleeding capital daily just to keep the lights on. Driven by economic desperation, he attempted to pivot back to his solo recording career to generate fast capital. In 1977, he secured a deal with ABC Records and released the album The Wonder of It All. He intended the project to act as a financial tourniquet. Instead, it became a clinical demonstration of the Nashville establishment's power to execute an industry-wide embargo. The major label executives and radio syndicators, the exact men Tompall had spent half a decade actively antagonizing and publicly humiliating, recognized his vulnerability. They had tolerated his defiance only when he possessed the leverage of producing multi-platinum assets. Stripped of that leverage, he was simply an aging, volatile, independent artist with a history of insubordination. The radio promotion networks executed a coordinated freeze-out. Program directors across the country refused to add Tompall's singles to their daily rotation. Furthermore, the market had shifted. The raw, aggressive outlaw movement Tompall helped engineer was rapidly transitioning into a highly sanitized mainstream commodity. The late 1970s marked the dawn of the urban cowboy era, defined by slick pop crossovers and heavily orchestrated ballads. Tompall's abrasive, unfiltered vocal delivery and cynical lyricism were deemed commercially obsolete. The ABC album failed to chart. It generated no touring demand and provided no capital to service the mounting debt at Hillbilly Central. Facing absolute financial ruin and the imminent foreclosure of his physical headquarters, Tompall executed a maneuver he had resisted for years. In 1979, he swallowed a decade of professional pride, picked up the telephone, and initiated contact with his younger brothers, Chuck and Jim. The relationship between the Glaser siblings had been completely fractured since the early 1970s. Jim and Chuck had walked away from the original trio to escape Tompall's dictatorial management style. They were exhausted by his relentless focus on building the Hillbilly Central infrastructure, a crusade that actively suppressed their collective vocal career. In the intervening years, they had established their own footholds in the industry. Jim Glaser had built a lucrative solo career as a songwriter, famously penning the massive pop crossover hit Woman, Woman for Gary Puckett and the Union Gap. Chuck was successfully managing publishing catalogs. They did not need Tompall's chaos. However, Tompall did not approach them with an appeal to familial warmth. He approached them with a cold, transactional proposition. He understood the industry metrics. He knew that his solo brand was toxic, but the Glaser brothers' trademark, their precise, genetically locked sibling harmony, still held significant, verifiable market value. The resulting reunion was brokered like a hostile corporate merger. It was a strictly tactical alliance. The brothers recognized that pooling their assets and resurrecting the trio was the only viable method to secure a massive cash advance from a major label. Utilizing their historical track record and the lingering cultural cachet of the outlaw era, they bypassed the Nashville cartel and successfully negotiated a lucrative contract with Elektra Records. Elektra was a label primarily operating out of Los Angeles, looking to buy their way into the country market without dealing with the established RCA/Columbia power structure. For a brief, highly profitable window, the strategy executed flawlessly. The brothers returned to the studio floor. Despite the deep-seated personal animosity, their physiological ability to harmonize remained intact. They recorded a polished, structurally complex cover of Chris Christopherson's track Lovin' Her Was Easier. The audio quality of the master recording was undeniable. Released in 1981, the single forcibly broke through the industry blacklist on the sheer strength of its vocal arrangement. It rapidly climbed to number 2 on the Billboard country charts. The corresponding album mirrored this massive commercial success. Suddenly, the Glaser brothers were reinstated on national television broadcasts and commanding top-tier, stadium-level booking fees for live performances. It appeared to be one of the most successful calculated resurrections in the history of the country music business. But the reunion was structurally hollow. The sudden influx of electric capital and touring revenue masked the severe internal rot caused by Tompall's unmanaged chemical dependency. The money did not alleviate his paranoia. It provided new targets for it. To support the Elektra album, the brothers were forced to embark on a grueling high-density national tour. This schedule physically removed Tompall from the controlled, isolated environment of Hillbilly Central and confined him to a Silver Eagle tour bus. To manage the physical exhaustion of the road and to suppress his escalating irrational anxiety regarding the accounting of their newly generated wealth, he accelerated his alcohol consumption to lethal levels. The toxic paranoia that had previously dismantled his partnership with Waylon Jennings was immediately redirected at Chuck and Jim. Tompall reverted entirely to his role as the absolute autocrat. He attempted to ruthlessly micromanage every aspect of the operation. He dictated their stage blocking, heavily criticized their vocal phrasing during live sets, and attempted to control their private interactions with the Elektra executives. The confines of the tour bus devolved into a psychological war zone. According to verified accounts from session musicians and road crew members employed during that 1981 tour, Tompall would routinely wait until the bus was in transit before initiating aggressive alcohol-fueled interrogations. He accused his brothers of skimming merchandise revenue. He fabricated elaborate conspiracies, alleging that Jim and Chuck were holding secret meetings with Elektra management to legally oust him from the corporate partnership and seize total control of the Glaser brothers brand. The same paranoid dependency that drove Waylon Jennings out of Hillbilly Central now infected the tour bus. Rational business discussion was dead on arrival. His threat assessment was completely shattered. This erratic hostility didn't just ruin the atmosphere, it actively sabotaged the live performances, the specific high-yield asset that had secured their financial comeback. He missed mandatory promotional commitments, initiated unprovoked screaming matches with venue promoters over minor technical issues, and alienated the local radio directors they desperately needed to keep the single on the charts. Jim and Chuck Glaser were seasoned, hardened industry veterans. They had already survived the exploitative Nashville machine, and they had survived Tompall once before. They recognized that the current operational environment was no longer just creatively stifling. It was physically dangerous and legally precarious. They were risking their own professional reputations to subsidize the delusions of a man heavily incapacitated by addiction. The breaking point was not a slow fade. It was swift, decisive, and permanent. In 1982, mere months after achieving their highest chart peak in a decade, the internal friction detonated. Jim and Chuck Glaser executed a hard stop. They formally severed all professional ties with Tompall. They refused to board the tour bus for the next leg of the schedule. They deliberately dissolved the corporate partnership and walked away from the Elektra contract, choosing to forfeit millions of dollars in potential future earnings rather than endure another 24 hours of Tompall's clinical paranoia. This second structural collapse was fatal. Tompall had played his final strategic card. He had cannibalized his own blood relations to secure a temporary financial reprieve, and his inability to govern his addiction had systematically destroyed that lifeline as well. The Glaser brothers were permanently finished as a commercial entity. Elektra Records and the broader major label system immediately dropped him, categorizing him as completely uninsurable and operationally unmanageable. The temporary influx of touring capital dried up the day his brothers walked off the bus, but the massive compounding debts associated with the physical property at 916 19th Avenue South remained fully intact. Tompall was right back where he started in the aftermath of the Jennings exit, but this time he had detonated the bridge to his own family. He was entirely out of allies. After the Elektra contract dissolved in 1982, the corporate isolation of Tompall Glaser was absolute. He had systematically alienated his primary financial anchor, his management partners, and finally, his biological family. The major labels did not view him as a misunderstood visionary. They viewed him as an uninsurable liability. The financial apparatus of Music Row operates on predictability and risk mitigation. Tompall represented the antithesis of both. He was blacklisted. This was not a formal, documented conspiracy, but a pragmatic industry consensus. Booking agents stopped returning calls. Studio musicians refused session work at Hillbilly Central, aware that invoices were unlikely to be paid. The physical asset of 916 19th Avenue South, once the operational headquarters of the outlaw movement, transitioned from a sanctuary into a decaying monument of debt. Without a steady stream of recording budgets to offset the massive commercial mortgage and the industrial utility costs, foreclosure became a mathematical certainty. Tompall was forced to liquidate. The recording consoles, the multi-track tape machines, and the physical building itself were sold off to satisfy creditors. He was stripped of the very infrastructure he had built to circumvent the major labels. The corporate machine he fought had not defeated him in the studio. They had starved him out through basic attrition. Stripped of his studio and his industry access, Tompall retreated into profound physical and psychological isolation. The 1980s and 1990s marked a period of total erasure. While Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson capitalized on the Outlaw brand, securing lucrative legacy tours, corporate sponsorships, and placements in the Country Music Hall of Fame, Tompall disappeared from the public record. He remained in Nashville, but he ceased to participate in its economy. He lived a reclusive existence, confined to his residence. The clinical realities of his chronic alcoholism now dictated his physical trajectory. Decades of processing high volumes of liquor had inflicted irreversible structural damage on his internal organs. Alcoholism, in its terminal stages, is not a slow fade. It is a systemic collapse. His liver function was severely compromised, limiting his body's ability to filter toxins. This hepatic failure cascaded, affecting his cardiovascular and neurological systems. He suffered from severe mobility issues and cognitive decline, the direct physiological consequences of sustained chemical abuse. The paranoia that had dismantled his professional empire in the 1970s was replaced by the brute physical reality of organ failure. On August 13, 2013, Tompall Glaser died at his home in Nashville. He was 79 years old. There was no grand tragedy or sudden accident. His death was the predictable medical conclusion of a body pushed beyond its physiological limits by decades of heavy, unmanaged substance dependency. The reaction from the Nashville establishment was calculated and brief. The major syndicators and industry organizations issued standard, sanitized obituaries. They acknowledged his role as a backing vocalist and briefly mentioned his association with the outlaw movement. They deliberately omitted his structural warfare against the RCA and Columbia monopolies. They omitted Glaser publications and his aggressive restructuring of publishing contracts. The industry chose to remember the compilation album cover, not the man who financed the recording sessions. History is written by the victors, and the victors in Nashville were the corporate executives who had outlasted him. The definitive historical record of Tompall Glaser remained buried until his nephew, Louis George, intervened. Recognizing the deliberate corporate erasure of his uncle's legacy, George initiated an extensive independent investigation. He bypassed the sanitized narratives controlled by the Country Music Association. He cross-referenced neglected studio logs, secured unreleased session tapes, and interviewed the surviving audio engineers and session players who had operated inside Hillbilly Central. This forensic reconstruction culminated in the publication of a comprehensive biography. The text forcibly reclaimed Tompall's status not merely as a singer, but as the primary logistical and financial architect of the most lucrative rebellion in country music history. Tompall Glaser did not survive the war he started. He identified the exploitative mechanics of a multi-million-dollar monopoly, built an independent infrastructure to bypass it, and armed the artists who ultimately bankrupted the old system. He possessed the tactical brilliance to dismantle Music Row, but he lacked the psychological endurance to govern his own mind. He chose the bottle to manage the stress of absolute defiance, and that choice cost him his empire, his family, and his legacy. He built the fortress that changed American music forever, only to die a forgotten exile outside its walls.